The HOA president stood on my porch with a leather folder, telling me my 70-year-old barn needed repainting. The red paint clashes with our community design palette. We prefer earth tones, beige taupe, soft gray. I wasn't in her HOA. She smiled. Your property is within our covenant boundary. Everyone contributes to community standards. Diane didn't know my family trust owned the mortgage on her entire neighborhood. $12 million, 12 months delinquent. $180,000 in arrears. She thought filing a fraudulent covenant and threatening lawsuits would force me to sell. Thought the $100,000 finder's fee she'd negotiated with the developer was guaranteed. She was wrong. By the time I found the hidden contract in her storage unit, it was too late to undo what happened next. Before we get started, let me know where you're watching from today, and be sure to hit like and subscribe for more great stories like this. The HOA president was standing on my porch with a leather folder telling me my 70-year-old barn needed to be repainted. Your barn is visible from the street, she said. The red paint clashes with our community design palette. We prefer earth, tones, beige, taupe, soft gray. I stared at her. It's a barn. It's supposed to be red. Our HOA has aesthetic standards. I'm sure you'll understand. She opened the folder and held out a thick packet. These are our architectural guidelines. Approved paint colors, fencing styles, landscaping standards. I'm not in your HOA. Her smile tightened. Your property borders our community. What you do affects our property values. You're within our covenant boundary. My family has owned this farm since 1952. Your HOA was formed in 2016. I'm not subject to your rules. We have a good neighbor policy, she said, still holding out the packet. Everyone contributes to community standards. Get off my property? Her smile disappeared. Completely. She set the packet on my porch railing and walked back to her white Lexus. Let me explain how I got here. 3 months earlier, my grandfather died and left me 15 acres and the farmhouse where I'd spent every childhood summer. The property had been in our family since 1952, back when this entire area was farmland and open fields. Now, those open fields were gone. 8 years ago, a developer bought the surrounding land and built 47 identical homes with vinyl siding and matching mailboxes. They called it Meadowbrook Estates. My grandfather's property, my property, now sat on a hill overlooking the whole development. Red barn, chicken coop, split rail fencing that had been there longer than most of the HOA residents had been alive. I decided to move in and restore it. Honor his memory. The family, the farmhouse needed work. Peeling paint on the barn. Fence posts that sagged. Overgrown brush everywhere. But it was mine, and I was going to bring it back. I moved in on a Saturday. By Monday, I was repainting the barn the same red it had always been. That's when the neighbors started driving by, slowly, staring up at the property like they couldn't figure out why a working farm existed next to their suburban paradise. Some waved. Most just looked confused. On day 8, Diane Foster showed up. 2 days after Diane's visit, I got a letter in the mail on Meadowbrook Estates, HOA letterhead, notice of violation, unpermitted exterior paint color barn structure, unapproved, fencing style, split rail, failure to submit architectural review application, fine, $500, escalating by $100 per day until corrected, action required, repaint barn in approved color, replace fencing with approved style. Submit all future modifications for board approval. I threw it in the trash. A week later, another letter arrived. The fine was now $1,200. A week after that, final notice a lien will be placed on your property if violations are not corrected within 10 days. I called a property attorney named Marcus Webb. Can't just claim authority over properties that were never part of the development, Marcus said. Give me a few days. I'll pull the HOA formation documents and the covenant. How long will this take? A week, maybe 2? Don't worry. If they file a lien, we'll get it removed. Before Marcus could get back to me, Diane returned. This time, she brought to board members a man in a polo shirt and a woman carrying a tablet. "We need to discuss your noncompliance," Diane said from my driveway. "I'm not in your HOA," I said. "You have no authority here. That's where you're wrong." She pulled a document from her folder. When Meadowbrook Estates was developed, all surrounding properties were included in the master plan. "You're within the covenant boundary. Let me see that." She handed it over. It was titled Meadowbrook Estates Community Covenant, filed with the county in 2016. The legal description outlined a boundary encompassing not just the 47 homes in the development, but also my 15 acres. All properties within the described boundary are subject to the governance of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. "This is nonsense," I said. "My grandfather never signed this. Doesn't matter. The county approved it when the development was filed. You're in the boundary. You're in the HOA." She crossed her arms. "You have 10 days to comply, or we're filing a lien and taking legal action. You can't just opt out of community standards." "Because you inherited an old farm?" The two board members looked uncomfortable. Diane didn't. "Get off my property," I said. She walked back to her car, the board members following. I called Marcus immediately. "They're claiming my property is in their HOA covenant. They filed a boundary in 2016 that includes my land." "Hey, did your grandfather sign anything?" "No. He died last year. He never had anything to do with that development." "Then the covenant doesn't apply to you. You can't unilaterally include someone's property in an HOA covenant without their consent. If they file a lien, I'll get it removed." "There's something else," I said. "Can you pull records on how that development was financed?" "Why?" "Just curious. Who owns what?" Marcus called me back 3 days later. I pulled the records on Meadowbrook Estates. The development was built by Horizon Development Group between 2016 and 2018. They financed construction with a $12 million loan from Regional Capital Bank. Did they pay it off? No. They restructured it into a permanent mortgage on the common property: the streets, clubhouse, pool, entrance gate. The HOA is responsible for monthly payments of $15,000. If they default, the lender can foreclose on all the common areas. So the HOA doesn't actually own their own streets? Not outright, they're mortgaged. It's not unusual for developments like this. He paused. "Why are you asking? Who holds the mortgage now?" "Regional Capital sold it in 2022, an investment company. Let me find the name." I heard papers shuffling. "Cascade Holdings, LLC. Ever heard of them?" My stomach dropped. "Yeah," I said slowly. "I've heard of them." "Shh. You know someone there?" "Cascade Holdings is my family's investment company. My uncle manages it through the family trust." Silence on the line. "You're telling me your family owns the mortgage on their HOA?" "Maybe. I need to confirm." I hung up and called my uncle. I said, "Quick question. Do we own a mortgage on a housing development called Meadowbrook Estates?" I heard him typing on his keyboard. Let me check the portfolio. ... Yes. We bought a package of distressed HOA mortgages in 2020. Meadowbrook is one of them. Why do you ask? How distressed? Pretty bad. They're 12 months behind on payments. We've been patient, but we were about to start foreclosure proceedings. Why? I looked out my window at the red barn, at the split-rail fence my grandfather built by hand, at the housing development sprawling across the valley below. "Because the HOA is threatening to sue me for not repainting my barn," I said, "and I just found out I own their entire neighborhood." On day 11, the lien hit. I found out when I checked my property records online. There it was. A lien filed against my property for $2,800 in accumulated fines for noncompliance with Meadowbrook Estates HOA architectural standards. I called Marcus immediately. "They actually filed it," I said. "I see it. This is invalid. Your property predates their HOA by 6 decades. He paused. "I'm filing a motion to dismiss and requesting proof that your property was properly included in their covenant." "They won't have it because it doesn't exist." "How long will that take?" "A few weeks. In the meantime, don't pay anything. This lien won't hold up." 2 days later, I found out the HOA wasn't waiting for court Tom. One of the homeowners who'd been with Diane during her second visit called me that evening. He sounded uncomfortable. "I thought you should know," he said. We had a special board meeting last night about your property. What about it? Diane called it the farmhouse problem. She said your property is bringing down home values. The buyers don't want to see a working farm when they're touring homes in Meadowbrook. And Greg, one of the other board members, asked if we could force you to tear down the barn. He paused. Diane said, not yet, but we could make it expensive enough that you'd give up and sell. What does that mean? They voted to increase your fines to $500 per day. And they voted to sue you for violation of community standards. I did the math in my head. $500 per day was $182,500 per year for owning. It's a barn that had been there since before any of them were born. Tom, I'm not in your HOA. I know. I voted against it. But I was outvoted 3-1. The lawsuit arrived 6 days later. Marcus read it to me over the phone while I stood in my kitchen, looking out at the barn they wanted gone. They're claiming your property is subject to the HOA covenant, that you've refused to comply with reasonable architectural standards, and that your property is causing measurable damage to surrounding home values. What do they want? A court order forcing you to repaint the barn in approved colors, remove the split rail fencing, and pay $15,000 in accumulated fines? He paused. There's also an alternative demand. What alternative? They want the court to grant them the right to purchase your property at fair market value if you refuse to comply. They want to force me to sell. That's what this says. And Diane's quoted directly in the complaint. She calls your property an eyesore. It's inconsistent with the community aesthetic and detrimental to property values. I looked at the red barn my grandfather had painted every 5 years for 70 years. File a motion to dismiss, I said. Start discovery. I want to know exactly how they think they have authority over land they don't own. Already working on it. Marcus filed the motion to dismiss 2 days later, along with a discovery request for all documents related to how the HOA covenant was established, and how my property was allegedly included. What came back was exactly what I expected, exactly what Diane had been hoping no one would look for. The original property was 60 acres. Purchased by my grandfather in 1952. In 1985, when the area started developing, a developer approached him about buying the land. My grandfather agreed to sell 45 acres but insisted on keeping the 15-acre hilltop where the farmhouse stood. The 1985 deed was explicit. It said grantor retains 15 acres as described herein, free from any covenants, restrictions, or encumbrances related to future development of the remaining parcel. In 2016, Horizon Development Group bought that 45-acre parcel and built Meadowbrook Estates. 47 homes, streets, clubhouse, pool. But when Horizon filed the HOA covenant with the county, they drew the boundary to include all 60 acres, including the 15. My grandfather had specifically excluded 30 years earlier. They'd drawn a boundary around land they didn't own and claimed HOA authority over it. Marcus called me when he found it. This is covenant fraud, he said. They included property in the HOA boundary that was explicitly excluded from development. Restrictions in 1985. The covenant is completely invalid as applied to your property. Can we prove that in court? Isley, the 1985 deed is recorded. Public record. Diane either didn't check or she knew and did it anyway. So we can get the lien removed? Absolutely. But there's something else you should know. I looked into how Meadowbrook Estates was financed. Marcus had pulled every financial document he could find on Horizon Development Group and the Meadowbrook Estates development. Construction started in 2016. It's financed by a $12 million loan from Regional Capital Bank. By 2018, all 47 homes were built and sold to individual buyers, but the construction loan was never paid off. Instead, it was restructured into a permanent mortgage not on the homes but on the common property. Streets, the clubhouse, the pool, the fancy stone entrance with Meadowbrook Estates carved into the pillars. All of it was mortgaged. HOA was responsible for making monthly payments of $15,000. If they defaulted, the lender could foreclose and take ownership of all the common areas. So the HOA doesn't actually own their own streets? I asked. Not outright. They're paying a mortgage on them, just like a homeowner pays a mortgage on a house. And here's where it gets interesting. Regional Capital sold that mortgage in 2020 to an investment firm. Who? Cascade Holdings, LLC. I went completely still. Say that name again? Cascade Holdings. They specialize in buying distressed debt. They purchased a portfolio of HOA mortgages in 2020, and Meadowbrook was one of them. I sat down at my kitchen table. Marcus, Cascade Holdings is my family's investment company. Silence. You're telling me you own their mortgage? My family trust does. I'm a trustee and beneficiary. Jesus. Do you know if they're current on payments? Yeah. Called my uncle while Marcus stayed on the line. Quick question, I said when he answered. Meadowbrook Estates, are they current on their mortgage payments? I heard typing. No, they're 12 months behind. I've been trying to work with them, but we were about to initiate foreclosure proceedings. Why? Because they just sued me. For owning a barn? My uncle laughed. You're kidding. I'm not. Well, they owe us $180,000. You want leverage? You've got it. I thanked him and hung up. Marcus was still on the line. They're 12 months delinquent, I said. $180,000 behind. Then, we have everything we need, Marcus said. I'm filing a counterclaim. Marcus's counterclaim was 22 pages. Long it detailed the covenant fraud, how the HOA had included my property in their boundary, despite the 1985 deed, explicitly excluding it from any development restrictions, called the lien invalid, and demanded its immediate removal. It accused the HOA of harassment and abusive process, and then on page 18, Marcus revealed that I was a trustee of Cascade Holdings, LLC, the company that owned the mortgage on every street, sidewalk, and common area in Meadowbrook Estates. He demanded they remove the lien, drop the lawsuit, pay the $180,000 in past due mortgage payments, and cover all my legal fees. We filed it on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday night, Tom called me. There was an emergency board meeting tonight, Tom said. It was absolute chaos. What happened? Greg read the counterclaim out loud. When he got to the part about Cascade Holdings owning our mortgage, he stopped and asked Diane if it was true. She said it was impossible. There was no way you could own our mortgage. What did your attorney say? He looked it up right there in the meeting. Confirmed that Cascade Holdings owns the mortgage, that you're listed as a trustee, and that we're 12 months delinquent. Tom paused. Diane's face went white. What did she say? She said, we can't pay $180,000. We don't have that kind of money in the HOA reserves. And our attorney said if we can't pay, you can foreclose and take ownership of the streets, the clubhouse, the pool, everything. How did the meeting end? Diane said she'd call you to discuss a settlement. 10 minutes after I hung up with Tom, my phone rang. It was Diane. Her voice was different now, smaller, uncertain. We need to talk, she said. I offered to talk, I said. You sued me instead. This has gotten out of hand. Can we?
Act cool.
Can we settle this? Maybe? What do you want? I looked out the window at my grandfather's barn, still painted bright red in the afternoon sun, exactly the way it had been for 70 years. Everything, said. Diane wanted to meet in person. She called 2 days after our phone conversation and asked if she could come to the farmhouse with the board members and their attorney. Her voice was careful, measured nothing like the condescending tone from our first meeting. We'd like to resolve this amicably, she said. They arrived on a Saturday morning. Diane, Greg, Sarah, Tom, and a man in a suit carrying a briefcase who introduced himself as Robert Chen, the HOA's attorney. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where my grandfather used to do the farm's bookkeeping. We appreciate you. Meeting with us, Diane said. Her hands were folded on the table, her usual confidence nowhere to be seen. We'd like to discuss a settlement. You sued me, I said. You filed a fraudulent lien against my property. You fined me $15,000 for owning a barn that's been here since 1952. And now you want to talk? We made mistakes, Diane said quickly. Can we start over? I looked at Marcus, who was sitting next to me. He nodded. Here's what happens, I said. You drop the lawsuit. Remove the lien. You publicly admit the covenant doesn't apply to my property, and you pay the past due mortgage $180,000, Greg spoke up. We don't have $180,000. Then I foreclose, I said. And I own your streets, your clubhouse, your pool, your entrance gate, everything. Robert Chen, the HOA attorney, leaned forward. Can we see the mortgage documents? We need to verify the amount owed. Marcus slid a folder across the table. Full accounting. $15,000 per month for 12 months. $180,000 total, plus late fees that we're willing to waive. Robert reviewed the documents carefully. Then he looked at Diane. Why did the HOA stop making payments? He had budget issues, Diane said. What kind of budget issues? I asked. You collect dues from 47 homes, right? I said. Yes. Diane said, how much per month? $350. I did the math out loud. That's $16,450 per month in revenue. Your mortgage payment is $15,000. That leaves $1,454 other expenses. So why couldn't you make the payments? Diane shifted in her seat. We have other expenses. Landscaping, management fees, legal costs. Show me. The financial records, I said. Robert looked at Diane. He has a legal right to see them. He's the mortgage holder. Diane reluctantly pulled out a binder and handed it to Marcus. Marcus went through the HOA's financial records, page by page, while we sat in silence. Monthly income, $16,450 from dues. Monthly expenses, community management, $4,500 to Premier HOA Services legal retainer, $2,000 landscaping, $3,500 to Foster and Sons landscaping administrative costs, $1, $200 mortgage payment, $15,000 unpaid for 12 months total monthly expenses, $26,200. The HOA was operating at a deficit of nearly $10,000 per month. Tell me about Premier HOA Services, I said. They handle day-to-day management, Diane said. Paperwork, compliance, communications with homeowners. What do they do that's worth $4,500 a month? They manage everything. It's a full-service contract. I pulled out my phone and searched the state business registry. Premier HOA Services, LLC. Registered owner, Diane Foster. I turned my phone around so everyone at the table could see. Been paying yourself $4,500 a month, I said. Greg stared at Diane. You told us Premier was an independent management company. It is, Diane said. I run it professionally. It's a legitimate business. In the landscaping? I asked. Foster and Sons Landscaping? Let me guess, that's your son's company? Diane's face flushed. My son runs a landscaping business. We hired him because he gave us a competitive rate. $100 a month to mow some grass and trim hedges. I said, that's not competitive. Marcus kept reading through the financial records. Then he stopped. There's something else here, he said. Special assessment from last year. $2,000 per home for emergency infrastructure repairs. That's $94,000 collected. But the records show only $30,000 spent on actual repairs. Where's the other $64,000? I asked. Marcus ran his finger down the page. Paid to Premier HOA Services for project management. You've been funneling HOA money into your own companies. I said, $8,000 a month, almost half the HOA budget. That's why you can't pay the mortgage. You're embezzling. From your own neighbors? That's not embezzlement, Diane said, her voice rising. Those are legitimate services. Work hundreds of hours managing this HOA. Then why didn't you disclose that you owned the companies? I asked Sarah. One of the board members spoke up. I read every board meeting's minutes. You never disclosed that Premier was your company. You never told us your son's company was. Doing the landscaping? I disclosed it, Diane insisted. No, Sarah said firmly. You didn't. Greg turned to Diane. You need to resign. I'm the president, Diane said. I've run this HOA since it was founded. The homeowners elected me. And you've run it into the ground, Greg said. We're $180,000 behind on our mortgage because you've been paying yourself instead.
The board can remove you for cause, Sarah added. And this is definitely cause. I'm calling for an emergency vote, Greg said. Motion to remove Diane Foster as HOA.
President for breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of funds. You can't do this, Diane said. All in favor? Greg said. Greg, Sarah, and Tom raised their hands. All opposed. Diane raised her hand alone. Motion passes 3-1, Greg said. I'm interim president effective immediately. Diane stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is illegal. I'll sue all of you. Get in line, I said. After Diane left, Greg turned to me. What do you want? He asked. You drop all claims against my property, remove the lien, issue a public statement admitting the covenant was invalid as applied to my property. Done, Greg said immediately. Diane resigns from the board permanently and pays back the money she embezzled. How much are we talking about? Marcus flipped through the financial records. Based on these documents, approximately $200,000 over 4 years. Premier HOA services and Foster & Sons combined, plus the special assessment. Project management fees. Greg looked pale. Can we structure a settlement? Here's my offer, I said. Diane pays back $100,000. I'll restructure the mortgage, reduce the monthly payment from $15,000 to $10,000. You fire Premier and Foster & Sons, bring in legitimate vendors at market rates, and you pay back the $180,000 in arrears over 3 years, interest-free. Greg looked at Sarah and Tom. They both nodded. That's more than fair, Greg said. Except, you need to get Diane to agree, I said. We'll talk to her, Greg said. They left. Marcus and I sat in the kitchen after they'd gone. Think she'll settle? Marcus asked. No, I said. She'll fight. I was right. Greg called me a week later. She won't settle, he said. She says she didn't do anything wrong, that the management and landscaping fees were fair market value, and that she's not paying back $1. What did you tell her? That you'd foreclose and take everything, that you'd sue her personally. She said to let you try she'd fight it in court. She doesn't have an attorney anymore, I said. Robert withdrew, right? The day after our meeting. He said he couldn't represent the HOA when there's an internal conflict of interest with a board member. Then she's on her own. I called Marcus that afternoon. File foreclosure proceedings on the common property, I said, and file a separate lawsuit against Diane personally for fraud and embezzlement. Both? Marcus asked. Both, 3 days later. Diane filed for bankruptcy. Marcus filed the foreclosure action on a Tuesday morning. The complaint was straightforward. 12 months of unpaid mortgage payments totaling $180,000, plus accumulated late fees. We were seeking transfer of ownership of all common property to Cascade Holdings, my family trust. That meant the streets, the sidewalks, the streetlights, the entrance gate with its carved stone pillars, the clubhouse, the pool, the playground, even the detention pond at the back of the development, everything that made Meadowbrook Estates a neighborhood, instead of just 47 houses sitting next to each other. The foreclosure notice was posted on the clubhouse door that afternoon. Meadowbrook Estates' Facebook group exploded within hours. What does this mean for our homes? Can you take our houses? Is this legal? We need an emergency meeting now. Greg posted a response that evening. Your homes are safe. The foreclosure only affects common area streets, clubhouse, pool. We're working on a solution. Emergency meeting tomorrow night at 7 p.m. 40 of the 47 homeowners showed up. I wasn't there, but Tom called me afterward and told me what happened. Greg stood at the front of the clubhouse and explained the situation. We're $180,000 behind on our mortgage because the previous president was paying herself and her son's company with HOA funds instead of making mortgage payments. The room erupted. We didn't know. How could this happen? Diane was sitting in the back. She stood up. This is a witch hunt. Those were legitimate business expenses. Homeowner named Jennifer stood up. You charged us $2,000 each last year for emergency repairs. $94,000 total. Only $30,000 went to actual repairs. You paid yourself $64,000 for project management. I managed that project, Diane shouted. Do you know how much work that was? You've been stealing from us for years, another homeowner said. Greg raised his voice. Diane was paid $4,500 every month through Premier HOA. Service is a company she owns and never disclosed. She paid her son $3,500 a month for landscaping that should cost $1,200. She embezzled approximately $200,000 over 4 years. Diane looked around the room at faces that had once elected her, trusted her, followed her rules. "I built this community," she said, her voice shaking. "I've worked hundreds of hours and paid yourself for every single one without telling us," Greg said. Diane grabbed her purse and walked out. 3 days after filing foreclosure, Marcus filed a separate lawsuit against Diane personally: fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, unjust enrichment. We were demanding $200,000 in restitution. Everything she'd taken from the HOA over 4 years. Diane's response came within a week. Chapter 7, Bankruptcy Filing. She listed $40,000 in assets and $180,000 in debts, including the potential judgment. From my lawsuit, Marcus called me when he saw the filing. "She's trying to discharge the debt through bankruptcy." "Can she do that?" "Not if we can prove fraud. Debts incurred through fraud aren't dischargeable. We'll object to the discharge and force a settlement." Diane's bankruptcy attorney apparently came to the same conclusion. He called Marcus 2 days later asking to discuss settlement terms. The foreclosure hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. The HOA had hired a new attorney, a woman named Patricia Moore, who specialized in HOA law, and made her case.
Your Honor,
The Meadowbrook Estates HOA was severely mismanaged by its previous president. The new board has implemented reforms and is working to correct the financial situation. We asked the court for time to catch up on the past due payments. The judge looked at her over his reading glasses. "How do you plan to pay $180,000? We're implementing significant budget cuts by replacing overpriced vendor contracts with market rate services. We're also considering a special assessment to raise the necessary funds." Marcus stood up. "Your Honor, the HOA already levied a special assessment last year, $2,000 per home. The homeowners can't afford another one, especially since the last one was largely embezzled by the former president." The judge turned to Patricia. "Is that true?" "The financial irregularities are being investigated," Patricia said carefully. "But the current board shouldn't be punished for the previous president's actions." "Your Honor," Marcus said, "if I may, there's a homeowner here who'd like to address the court." Tom stood up from the gallery. The judge nodded. "Go ahead, Your Honor, I'm Tom Brennan. I live in Meadowbrook Estates. We already paid a special assessment last year, $2,000 per household. Most of us are middle-class families. Can't afford another assessment that size." He paused. "What this foreclosure goes through, what happens to our property values? What happens to our neighborhood?" The judge looked at Marcus. "Counselor, if your client forecloses, what are his intentions?" "My client would own the streets, sidewalks, clubhouse, and all common areas. He could charge homeowners for street maintenance, pool access, trash collection essentially, anything the HOA currently provides. Or he could simply maintain ownership and continue the existing arrangements under terms he dictates." Several homeowners in the gallery looked sick. The judge closed the file in front of him. "I'm ordering mediation before I make any ruling. You have 2 weeks to reach a settlement." The mediator was a retired judge named Harold Webb, who'd spent 30 years handling HOA disputes. He sat at the head of a conference table with me and Marcus on one side, Greg and Patricia on the other. "Let me ask you directly," he said to me. "What do you want here? To punish these people or to get paid?" "I want to be left alone," I said. "I want my property recognized as separate from their HOA. And yes, I want the mortgage paid." Turned to Greg. "Can you pay $180,000? "Not immediately. Our homeowners don't have it. Then he forecloses and owns your entire neighborhood infrastructure." "We understand that," Greg said. "But Diane is gone. She filed bankruptcy. She's resigned from the board. We're trying to fix what she broke. We're asking for a chance."
hey,
Mediator looked at me. He has a point. "Are you willing to negotiate?" I looked at Marcus. He nodded slightly. "I already offered them terms," I said. Diane refused. "If they're willing to settle now, I'll listen." We spent 4 hours negotiating. Final terms? The HOA would formally acknowledge that my property was never validly included in the covenant. All fines would be voided, the lien removed, and a formal written apology issued, Diane would pay $50,000. From her bankruptcy, estate reduced from the $200,000 we'd sued for. But more realistic given her assets, the HOA would pay back the $180,000 in arrears over 5 years at $3,000 per month. Interest-free. I would permanently reduce the monthly mortgage payment from $15,000 to $8,000. If the HOA defaulted again, foreclosure would be automatic with no cure period. That's more than fair, Greg said. We accept. It needs homeowner approval, Patricia said. We'll get it, Greg said. The special meeting was held 3 days later. 45 homeowners attended. Greg presented the settlement terms and explained. What would happen if they didn't approve it? I would foreclose, own all their common property, could charge them whatever I wanted for services. Why should we pay for Diane's theft? One homeowner asked. Because the debt is owed by the HOA, not by Diane personally, Greg said. If we don't settle, we lose everything. Our streets, our pool, our clubhouse. We'd be at his mercy for basic services. The vote was 41-4 in favor. The settlement was approved. Diane's bankruptcy. Trustee reviewed her assets and found she owned 3 properties, her primary residence and 2 rental properties. She had approximately $180,000 in equity. Marcus objected to her bankruptcy discharge, arguing that debts incurred through fraud aren't dischargeable. The bankruptcy judge agreed to a settlement. Diane would liquidate 1 rental property and pay $50,000 to me as part of the bankruptcy estate. It's distribution. She signed the papers without saying a word. The HOA issued a formal written apology on their letterhead. Meadowbrook Estates HOA acknowledges that the property located at address was improperly included in the HOA covenant without the owner's consent. We apologize for filing invalid fines and liens. We acknowledge the owner has no obligation to follow HOA rules or architectural guidelines. They posted it on the HOA website and mailed it to every homeowner. The fraudulent lien was removed from the county records. All fines were voided. My property was officially confirmed as separate from the HOA. The HOA fired Premier, HOA Services, and Foster & Sons Landscaping. They hired a legitimate management company for $800 per month and a new landscaper for $1,200 per month, saving $6,000 monthly. It's enough to cover the reduced mortgage and actual operating expenses. The first payment arrived on schedule. $3,000. Toward the arrears and $8,000 for the monthly mortgage, Greg called me after making the payment. We should have looked at the finances years ago. We trusted Diane and never asked questions. Lesson learned, I said. 3 months later, Greg called again. We found something, he said. Diane had a storage unit in the HOA's name. We didn't know it existed until the bill came due. When we cleaned it out, we found boxes of records she'd hidden. What kind of records? You need to see them? Can I bring them over? He arrived that afternoon with 3 bankers' boxes full of documents. Inside were emails, contracts, and meeting notes that Diane had never shared with the board. And at the bottom of the second box, I found a contract dated 8 months before Diane ever knocked on my door. It was between Diane Foster and Sunrise Communities. Development a contract to acquire my 15-acre property for subdivision development. The developer would pay the HOA $500,000. Diane would receive a $100,000 finder's fee. She'd been planning to force me out from the very beginning. Greg called me on a Saturday morning 3 months after the settlement was finalized. We found something, he said. Diane had a storage unit. It was registered in the HOA's name, but none of us knew it existed until the rental bill showed up last week. What was in it? Boxes of documents she never showed the board. Emails, contracts, meeting notes. You need to see this. He arrived an hour later with Sarah, another board member. They carried 3 bankers' boxes into my kitchen and set them. On the table, she kept all of this hidden, Sarah said. Everything important she never shared with us. I started going through the first box. Emails, printed and organized by date. Financial records that didn't match what she'd shown the board. meeting notes with entire sections marked confidential, not for board review. And then, at the bottom of the second box, I found a contract. It was dated 8 months before Diane ever knocked on my door. The contract was between Diane Foster, acting as HOA representative, and Sunrise Communities Development Corporation. The plan was simple.
Oh!
Sunrise would acquire my 15-acre property and develop it into 22 additional homes and expansion of Meadowbrook Estates. The total development value was estimated at $8 million. In exchange for facilitating the acquisition, Diane would receive a $100,000 consulting fee. The HOA would receive $500,000 for infrastructure improvements and expansion. It kept reading. There were emails going back 2 years long before I'd inherited the property. Diane had approached Sunrise about expanding the development. They'd identified my grandfather's farm as the ideal location. Then my grandfather died, and I inherited. The emails after that told a different story. From Diane to Sunrise Communities, the new owner has moved in. He's refused to comply with HOA standards. We need to force him out. From Sunrise to Diane, can your HOA claim authority over the property? From Diane to Sunrise, we filed a covenant in 2016 that includes his land in our boundary. No, it's invalid. I'll make it expensive for him to stay. He'll sell. From Sunrise to Diane, good. Make him want to leave. We'll be ready to make an offer when he does. I kept reading through the emails. Diane's strategy was laid out in her own words. File fines for trivial violations. Escalate to daily penalties. File a lien to cloud his title. Sue him for non-compliance. Make the legal costs so high that selling becomes the cheaper option. In one email to the developer, she wrote, "He'll give up eventually. They always do." I called Greg and Sarah back. To the farmhouse that evening, after I'd read everything. "Did you know about any of this?" I asked. "No," Greg said immediately. She told us the lawsuit was about protecting property values. She said your farm was hurting home prices, and we needed to enforce standards. She never mentioned she'd personally get $100,000 if she forced me to sell. Sarah shook her head. Never. We thought we were defending the community. We had no idea she had a financial interest. She lied to all of us, Greg said. She used the HOA to run a con so she could profit from your land. I handed the contract to Marcus the next morning. Marcus read through everything, the contract. Emails Diane's notes about her strategy to force out the farmhouse owner. "This isn't embezzlement anymore," he said. "This is fraud and conspiracy. She knowingly filed a false covenant boundary, knowing your property wasn't validly included. She did it specifically to pressure you into selling so she could collect a finder's fee from the developer. Can we use this?" "Absolutely. I'm filing a motion to reopen the fraud case. This proves intentional fraud, not just financial mismanagement. Fraud debts aren't dischargeable in bankruptcy." Diane's bankruptcy attorney called Marcus 2 days after. "We filed the motion. This is bad for my client," he said. "If the court finds intentional fraud, she can't discharge the debt. We need to talk settlement." "It's too late for settlement," Marcus said. "We're going to trial." The fraud case went to trial 6 weeks later. Diane sat at the defendant's table with her attorney, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. The confidence, the condescension, the certainty, all of it was gone. Marcus presented the emails. The contract with Sunrise Communities, Diane's handwritten notes about her strategy to force me out. He walked the judge through the timeline. Diane negotiating with the developer before I even inherited the property. Filing the fraudulent covenant boundary, escalating fines and legal action, all to pressure me into selling so she could collect her finder's fee. Diane's attorney tried to argue the documents were taken out of context. My client was exploring options to expand the community and increase property values. She never intended to force anyone out. Marcus pulled up an email on the screen. "This is from your client to Sunrise Communities, dated 4 months ago." Quote, "Don't worry, I'll get rid of him." How is that out of context? Diane's attorney looked at his client. She stared at the table. That was ... Frustration, Diane said quietly. "Not a plan." Marcus called a representative from Sunrise Communities to testify. The man confirmed that Diane had approached them about acquiring my property. She'd promised to deliver it within a year, that they'd agreed to pay the HOA, $500,000 plus pay, and personally, $100,000. Did Ms. Foster tell you the property? Owner was unwilling to sell? Marcus asked. Yes, she said he was trespassing on HOA property and would be forced out through legal action. Did you believe her? We prepared an acquisition offer based on her assurances. The judge ruled from the bench. Ms. Foster committed intentional fraud. This wasn't negligent mismanagement of HOA funds. This was a deliberate scheme to defraud both the property owner and the HOA for personal profit. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $150,000. This debt is not dischargeable in bankruptcy. Diane closed her eyes. Diane was forced to sell both rental properties to pay the judgment. After the mortgages were paid off, she had $180,000 in proceeds. $150,000 went to me. The remaining $30,000 went to other creditors. She was left with only her primary residence, which was protected under bankruptcy law. The HOA, under Greg's leadership, sued Sunrise Communities. For conspiracy, the developer settled quickly for $200,000 to avoid prolonged litigation and negative publicity. The HOA used that money to pay down the mortgage arrears, reducing the balance owed to me by $200,000. Marcus also referred the case to the county prosecutor. After reviewing the evidence, the prosecutor filed criminal charges: felony theft and fraud for embezzling, $200,000 from the HOA. Diane's criminal attorney negotiated a plea deal. She pled guilty to misdemeanor embezzlement in exchange for 18 months probation, 200 hours of community service, restitution already. Satisfied through the civil judgment, she accepted the plea rather than risk trial and a potential 5-year sentence. Finished restoring the farmhouse and barn. I painted the barn the brightest red I could find, exactly what Diane had hated. Installed a wooden sign at the entrance. Mitchell Family Farm ESD, 1952. I planted flowers along the split-rail fence, making them more visible from the road. Everything Diane had wanted removed, I made more prominent. A property appraiser came by for a routine assessment. He looked at the barn, the farmhouse, the flowers. You know, he said, historic properties like this actually add value to surrounding homes. People like living near preserved farmland. It's a selling point, not a liability. The exact opposite of what Diane had claimed. The HOA functioned smoothly under Greg's leadership. Payments arrived on time every month. Occasionally I'd help with HOA projects, fixing a fence, advising on landscaping. The relationship was good now. If Diane had just knocked on your door and asked nicely, none of this would have happened. Greg said one afternoon, he was right. I was sitting on the farmhouse porch on a Saturday morning 2 years after the settlement when a car slowed at the property entrance. A woman got out and started taking photos of the barn. I walked down the driveway. Can I help you? I asked. She turned, startled. Oh, I'm with Sunrise Communities. We're still interested in this property for development. You consider selling? We'd pay a premium price. I smiled. No. We could offer $2 million. This land's been in my family for 74 years, I said. It's not for sale.
Right.
She handed me a business card. If you change your mind, I watched her drive away. Then I tore the card in half and walked back to the porch. Some things aren't for sale. 3 years after the settlement, the farmhouse looked exactly the way my grandfather would have wanted it. The barn was painted bright red. It's the same shade it had been for 70 years. The split-rail fencing was repaired and maintained. Chicken coop was rebuilt, and I had a dozen hens laying eggs. The property had been featured in the local Heritage Society magazine under the title, Preserving Agricultural History in Suburban Development. Everything Diane had called an eyesore was now considered historic preservation. Meadowbrook. Estates had stabilized completely under Greg's leadership. The mortgage arrears were fully paid off using the settlement money from Sunrise Communities. The HOA had made every monthly payment on time for 3 years straight. Dues had been reduced from $350 to $275 per month after they cut out Diane's fraudulent vendor contracts. Every quarter, Greg posted complete financial reports online. Every expense was documented. Every vendor contract was competitively bid. The HOA had become what it was supposed to be, a service organization, not a power structure, and the farmhouse that Diane claimed would destroy property values? Real estate agents now mentioned it in their listings. Charming home near historic farmhouse. Children from the neighborhood would walk up the hill and ask if they could see the chickens and the barn. I started hosting occasional farm tours for families on weekends. An appraiser confirmed what I'd suspected. The historic farmhouse added a 3 to 5% premium to nearby home values. Homes in Meadowbrook Estates had increased 22%, in value over 3 years higher than comparable neighborhoods. Everything Diane claimed would hurt the community had actually enhanced it. Diane completed her probation and community service. She lost both rental properties to pay the judgment against her. The state real estate board suspended her license after reviewing the fraud case. She was working as a manager at a retail store 2 towns over. She'd moved away from Meadowbrook, couldn't afford to stay even if she'd wanted to. Occasionally, she posted on social media about the corrupt system and how she'd been targeted for standing up for homeowners. No one engaged with her posts anymore. I saw her once at a farmer's market where I was selling eggs. Our eyes met across the crowd. She looked away quickly and kept walking. I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction. She was irrelevant now. I started researching HOA disputes after everything settled, and I realized how common this was. Dozens of cases across the country where HOAs claimed authority over properties that were never properly included in their covenants. Usually, the property owners gave up. Fighting was too expensive. The HOA had collected dues from dozens or hundreds of homes they could afford lawyers. Individual owners couldn't. I'd only won because of sheer luck. My family trust happened to own the mortgage on their common property. Without that leverage, I might have lost everything. So I created a website called Know Your Property Rights. I shared my story and provided resources for people fighting invalid HOA claims. Within months, I was getting emails from people nationwide. Facing similar situations, a woman from Texas wrote, "My HOA claimed my inherited property was subject to their rules. I was about to give up. Your story gave me the courage to fight. I checked the deed. They never had authority. Thank you." A local property rights group asked me to speak at their meeting. I stood in front of 50 homeowners and small landowners and told them the whole story. Document everything, I said. Know exactly what you own. Don't assume the HOA has authority just because they claim it. Most importantly, check who owns what. You might have more leverage than you think. Thought about my grandfather often during those years. He'd refused to sell all 60 acres back in 1985 when the first developer came calling. He could have made a fortune. Instead, he sold 45 and kept 15 specifically to preserve the family farm. His foresight had saved this property too. Honor that. I worked with a local land trust to establish a conservation easement. The farmhouse and surrounding land could never be developed, even after my death. It was protected permanently, a piece of agricultural history preserved in the middle of suburban sprawl. Tom stopped by one afternoon while I was working in the garden. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "We all voted to support Diane's lawsuit against you. We didn't know she was lying." "You were lied to," I said. "That's not your fault. Still, we should have asked more questions. Should have looked at the finances, checked her claims." "Most people in your HOA aren't bad people," I said. "You trusted your president to tell the truth. When you learned she wasn't, you removed her. The system worked eventually." He nodded. "Greg's doing a good job now. It's boring, which is exactly what an HOA should be. Sunrise Communities tried one last time. A senior vice president showed up at my door with a briefcase and a smile. He offered $3 million for the property. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'll never sell." "Please stop asking. Can I ask why? You could make a fortune." I looked past him at the barn, at the fields, at the farmhouse where my grandfather had lived for 60 years. "Because it's not about money," I said. "It's about legacy. My nephew visits most weekends now. He's 8 years old. He helps me feed the chickens, works in the garden, asks endless questions about family history. I teach him what my grandfather taught me, how to repair fences, paint a barn, care for the land. Will I get to live here someday? He asked last month. If you want to, I said, it'll be yours to protect. I stood on the hill last week, the same spot where my grandfather used to stand, and look out over his property, the farmhouse and barn behind me, the fields stretching out, beyond that Meadowbrook Estates, 47 homes with their matching mailboxes and manicured lawns, 2 different worlds, coexisting, but now in balance, not conflict. I thought about how close it had come to being. Lost. If Diane had succeeded, this would be 22 more identical houses by now. The barn torn down. The farmhouse demolished. 70 years of family history erased, but I'd fought back. And I'd gotten lucky with leverage I didn't even know I had. The real victory wasn't beating Diane in court or collecting the judgment. The real victory was preserving what my grandfather built, keeping the promise to protect this land, ensuring it survives for the next generation. The HOA runs smoothly now. No drama, no lawsuits, no power-hungry presidents trying to control things they don't own. Just people living in their homes, maintaining common areas, paying their bills, and me living in my farmhouse, everything as it should be. I sat on the porch last night at sunset, watching the chickens peck around the yard. The barn glowed red in the fading light. The sign at the entrance read, Mitchell Family Farm EST, 1952, protected forever. A neighbor waved from the street below. I waved back. Life is good.